Brought to you by Discovery Invest, the formula for successful investing. Brought to you by Discovery Invest, the formula for successful investing.
Hello and a warm welcome to this post-budget analysis with myself, Gugulethu Cele. Now, entrepreneurs and businesses are the key drivers of any economy, and in South Africa specifically, they're the third largest contributors to tax. In the next 30 minutes, we will be speaking to chief executives to get their views and response to South Africa's 2017 budget. Joining me for this in studio is Matse Modise, Managing Director of Simudisa, and Andrew Darfour, who's the Group Chief Executive Officer of Alexander Forbes. And on the line is Colin Coleman, Managing Director of Goldman Sachs International, with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. Good to have you, each and every one of you, as a guest here on the show. We will be getting Colin up on the line very shortly on the telephone. But first things first, we always hear about subdued business confidence. The minister reflected on it in his speech. From the both of you, starting with you, Andrew, how much confidence do you have post the budget that was delivered today?
Sure, thank you for that. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start off by congratulating Minister Gordon for what I think is a credible budget. It's a budget which is really pro-poor. It's a budget where your hands are tied and you've got to make the right decisions. So I think it's a very credible budget, and I think it was a fiscally sound budget in the context of what's going on. So I think Minister Gordon should be commended for the budget he's put forward.
Thumbs up for his efforts on that note. Matse, your thoughts?
I would concur. I believe that given the tough economic times we're having, and with not much space to move around, the minister did fairly well. Yes, very much pro-poor. Enough was said for how do they intend to catalyze growth of the SMEs. It's definitely much more than what was said last year. And essentially, I think it's, Minister Gordon tends to engender a sense of calm and things will be okay given such time. So I give it a thumbs up.
Thumbs up there too. We'll come back to the element regarding SMMEs and the increase in investment and into their coffers regarding that. But Colin, we'd like to come to you over the telephone now and also getting your views on confidence, given that as well you are part of several initiatives which work with the Minister of Finance in trying to alleviate the jobs crisis we have in South Africa and levels of uncertainty. But your overview, are you as confident as your colleagues here in the studio with regard to the budget so far? Not too sure if you can hear us clearly on the line there, Colin, but just gauging your views on confidence levels following the delivery of the budget today. Okay, seems like technical gremlins are working against us, so those aren't in favor so far today. But let's pick up on the major issue, starting off with SMMEs, who later hopefully can grow to become leaders in large corporate entities like yours, Andrew. But SMMEs, you mentioned that they did get a significant increase with regard to contribution to their coffers. But are we still lacking some kind of guidance as to what this enabling environment is that will encourage participation and growth in the SMME sector?
Sure, I think it's important to understand what SMMEs are looking for. So they're looking for some form of tax relief, some form of growth enabling VAT. So we didn't hear much within that regard. Coordination, better coordination between the public and the private sector, and essentially also the reduction of red tape and our ability to have efficient state-owned entities and development funding institutions that actually nurture a pipeline of healthy, sustainable businesses. So in that regard, I mean, he mentioned that also there is this big procurement opportunity of 1.5 trillion rands within the next 3 years. So that means that small businesses are able to take advantage of that, and there's a specific 30% set aside for SMMEs and black-owned enterprises and women and youth. So as much as that's been said, now we have to ensure that it is implemented because we have to see the impact of what's being said. And I think there was a strong message around better coordination, collaboration, and also the sense of people need to have access to all of these opportunities. And the collaboration between the public and the private sector, I mean, the private sector has incubators, accelerators, capacity builders. So how do we ensure that those facilities that we have and then are doing pretty well in nurturing a pipeline of healthy SMEs that can contribute towards economic growth, that we actually work quite closely with the government to access all that has been said is available for SMEs.
A twofold question for the both of you, actually, when it comes to preferential procurement as well as SMMEs seeing increased linkages with government but also to the private sector. This was also reflected in the speech, State of the Province address by Gauteng Premier David Makhura, that there's this over-reliance by SMMEs to want to seek work from the government only. Number one, is government incentivizing the private sector enough to actually procure services from these entrepreneurs? And are we actually seeing the market open up where young entrepreneurs do have access to actually communicate with larger corporates in order to create this enabled environment all around?
Well, you certainly need facilitators of that. You have to have a conduit between the public and the private sector, and civil society organizations and other private sector institutions tend to be a good conduit that will create that balance. For example, as much as there is all this money that's accessible to SMEs, we cannot just give it to entrepreneurs or SMEs that are not ready to sustainably provide the corporates and provide their services. They have to ensure these are strong small businesses that will be reliable, that will grow over time, and such opportunities are actually leveraged, not wasted.
And that's the certainty you need.
I would add to that. So when you look at South Africa, the largest employers is obviously government. But outside of that, it's really SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises. That's 75% literally of businesses. So the question you ask is, can more be done between government and private sector to encourage SME growth? The answer is undeniably yes. But coming back to a couple of points raised earlier around what the ministers put forward, it's very similar to many emerging market economies. When you think of the challenges in South Africa, so essentially you've got high unemployment, you've got low GDP growth, you've got essentially social reform that's come in, social inequality, wealth inequality. So when you're faced with the hard facts, so you look at what's the debt to GDP ratio, it's not good. So how do you raise the 28 billion or thereabouts? That's in terms of what's needed. So the emphasis, you've got to tax the wealthy. I think that's clear. Now, and obviously, could that have gone to other segments? Possibly. Was 4% the right number? Who knows? Maybe a bit more than you and I may like, but it's a good start in this thing. So I think it's a credible play. More needs to be done between government and private sector, but it's a start. It's absolutely a start, and I think he's got to be commended for taking the bold step.
Taking a bold step. Colin, I understand the line has been re-established with you, and we've got you on the line now. Let's bring you into the conversation, and certainly maybe starting off from the point that Andrew raises here is moving in the right direction for the finance minister to actually see an increase in the taxes on wealthy individuals. Many of these individuals are entrepreneurs as well as business leaders themselves. Could this knock confidence slightly, perhaps, from these individuals and their view on investment and growth in this particular economy? Some challenges there. Colin, very briefly, if you can hear us, jump into the conversation here, getting your views on the budget speech. Very pro for the poor, a tax on the wealthy, as Andrew mentions, which is in line with what we see in other emerging markets. Your view and your response to this particular move by the finance minister?
Look, I think the key of understanding this budget is effectively through the relative social, economic and fiscal constraints. The finance minister has charted a course which is effectively holding the centre, with very little room to maneuver. So he has met many of the goals in a situation where he's had to plug a hole through increasing income tax for wealthy. And he's done a very, very good job, I think, of helping South Africa through this extremely difficult period.
Corporate taxes haven't gone up, Colin. In your view, is this maybe a means to encourage the private sector to continue investing in this market?
Look, I think it's a situation where you have to do some. This was possibly, in his view, the least hurtful thing to do. Doesn't mean it doesn't know pain, but I think where we are in South Africa at this point in time is that everybody needs to have some sacrifice in order to get through this period and reestablish growth going forward and maintain the centre. That's what I think he has done. He's charted that course. I think from his point of view, this is a continuation of the fiscal consolidation path. Hopefully we could have heard a little bit more detail on state-owned enterprise reform, which is an area the business sector doesn't really control. but that would have been nice to have. It would have been very important, but I don't believe politically it was something that he could deliver at this point in time.
Very briefly, before we let you go, Colin, something else the Minister kept on emphasizing was increased partnerships between the private sector as well as government. You yourself are involved in several initiatives with the Minister of Finance and other of your peers in the private sector. Are there any developments that we see with regard to boosting entrepreneurship, the Jobs Fund, as well as increased support overall for some of these initiatives?
Look, we are still aiming to launch the Youth Employment Service Initiative aimed at putting 1 million interns into the economy over a 3-year period around mid-July. We are working hard to that end. The Small Micro Enterprise Fund of Adrian Gore and Brian Jaffe has been launched effectively, and those are two big initiatives that the Minister did mention in his speech. But more importantly, there are certain things like, for example, in President Zuma's State of the Nation address, he mentioned, the partnership between Eskom and the independent power producers. I think, getting behind that and getting those things signed and delivered is very, very important, that we get real economic investment as partnerships between private and public sector and allow the private sector to invest in these important areas. So I think that, those are the healthy signs. I think we'd like to see much more in terms of governance and solid management in the state-owned enterprises, and getting bang for our buck out of the public expenditure items that the Minister has mentioned.
Thank you so much. That was Colin Coleman, Managing Director there of Goldman Sachs International. Well, we will continue our conversation with both my guests here in studio, Andrew Darfour from Alexander Forbes and Matsi Modise from Simodisa, taking a look at the post-budget analysis from leaders in the private sector.
Brought to you by Discovery Invest, the formula for successful investing. Brought to you by Discovery Invest, the formula for successful investing.
Welcome back to our panel, which certainly continues here, the CEO's analysis of the South African 2017 budget speech. Still with me in studio is Matsi Modise, Managing Director of Simodisa, and Andrew Darfour, Group Chief Executive Officer of Alexander Forbes. Just before the break, we also spoke to Colin Coleman, who gave us some perspective with regard to his involvement in the SMME fund, as well as trying to ensure that there are 41 million plus interns that can get into the workforce. And Matsi, you've got commentary with regard to the participation of the private sector, how much has been done, and perhaps the minimal progress that actually has been achieved. Well,
sure. It's good that Colin did mention that private sector took a very bold move to establish a 1.5 billion rand SME fund, which has now recently allocated a CEO, so it's functioning. But the whole ambition around that was that it would be a co-investment fund between the government and the private sector. So the sentiment is that whether government comes on board or not, we are going to do this. We're going to inject some capital into early stage investments, which is the big funding gap in South Africa. But now it's, well, for us to catalyze venture capital and our ability to fund the guy that has an idea, fund the guy that's looking for working capital, 100,000 rands. If the government doesn't contribute towards catalyzing that, then it's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, it's possible, but it's going to take far longer. Early stage investments is quite risky. So we need to leverage that risk by having the public and the private sector invest in it. So it's a very bold move. The private sector is going to continue with or without the government, but also last year during the State of the Nation address, there was a sovereign innovation fund that was proposed by the president. That's essentially going to ensure the growth of innovation and technology in South Africa. But a year later, nothing has been done, nothing has been heard. So there has to be a level of consistency, in the government's ability to actually implement what they're saying, because the few things that they talk around developing and supporting SMEs are we literally hang on to them. But if nothing really follows on, then it's a bit disappointing.
But isn't it the beauty about the private sector nonetheless that even though the system might not work in your favor, you still carry on and get the job done, right?
Yeah,
and reap some of the rewards.
If I may be so humble, I think you're being a bit harsh. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's a bold move. I think we need more of these initiatives, and ultimately the government will catch up. But we've got to start. It's working. We need more of it. So it's a step in the right direction.
Very briefly, to come back to you, Andrew, before we move on to another guest, Cas Kovadia of the Banking Association of South Africa, education. More money has been pumped into that particular budget allocation of the fiscal this year. Doesn't that have a positive impact for the private sector, where now you have more educated people perhaps coming out of the workforce?
It's an important point, though, because it's not just about an educated population, but it's also about improving financial literacy so people can take the right decisions. So we certainly support the move. I think there's been a lot of rhetoric around fees must fall, and I think this is a step in the right direction. So again, it's positive steps, baby steps at a time. Could it have been bolder? Possibly. Could the minister have pushed for VAT? Maybe it might have reached a tipping point. But again, it's bold moves are needed to push the economy forward in the right way.
I'm going to take that question and pose it to our next guest on the line, Cas Kovadia, the Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa. Cas, good to have you with us. And naturally, you've been privy to half of the conversation with my guest here in studio. But could have the budget been slightly bolder, despite the positive steps that have been taken by the Minister of Finance?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Could the budget perhaps have been a little bit bolder, maybe seeing an increase in VAT and providing some tax incentives for SMMEs and entrepreneurs, despite the efforts that the minister has already made?
Well, I think there was a lot of talk about increasing VAT, but I think that we do need to appreciate that the budget is actually delivered within a broader socio-economic and political context.
Not too sure if we've lost you on the line there slightly, but thank you so much for your participation. That's Cas Kovadia, Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa. Andrew, I'd like to come back to you and getting your view on this budget that perhaps is pro-poor and taxing on the wealthy. How, from an Alexander Forbes perspective, where you're a financial services provider, how do you approach the dynamics of the South African consumer, where you've got this depressed consumer appetite, limited spending, and now the more wealthy individuals who perhaps do have a little bit more room to move might be a little bit more cautious with regard to their investment and their spending decisions now going forward? Does that change your view on
No, I don't think it does. And the way I've framed this budget is it's doing what's right for South Africa. It's doing what's right to try to stimulate GDP growth, try to stimulate the economy. You take the example of, say, America. They're also trying to stimulate the economy by doing different things. They're actually cutting tax in some respects, potentially with Trump. But I think what we have here is a sound fiscal plan to get the economy moving in the right direction. So certainly at Alexander Forbes, what we talk about is how do we give good advice to our clients to make the right decisions. Biggest challenge in terms of most SME organizations is employees who have debt. So how do you change destructive debt to constructive debt through good advice? How do you have a financial goal? So ultimately, this doesn't change the equation. It's just a redistribution of wealth from one segment to the next segment. Unemployment is 35% in South Africa. A lot of people have given up hope. This actually will force, that conversation on how do we create employment in South Africa and GDP growth. So I think from our perspective, we support this budget. It's the right budget. Could more have been done? Possibly, but it's a good budget. It's a start.
It's a start and it's a good budget. Cas, to come back to you as well, I do want to get your view on the perceptions of the budget again and the level of confidence that might be felt within the banking fraternity. We did hear the minister alluding to the alleged collusive activity that's been taking place, whether it's in the bread industry or the construction industry, and more recently in the headlines, the banking fraternity. But given the moves that have been made, do you believe that confidence will still be instilled in international investors here?
Look, I think it was a pretty reasonable budget speech under the circumstances. I think his delivery was such that he is very clear that the challenges we have, including the current mantra of radical economic transformation and restructuring, is not a zero-sum game. It's also something that we have to collaborate as a different sectors of our society to make happen. So I think that it was a good budget. I think the issues he raised around, the structure of the economy, concentration, and so on are issues that the Standing Committee on Finance is going to be looking at in the middle of March at public hearings, and we will participate in those hearings. But I think generally it was a good budget under very difficult circumstances, as he's done before actually last year. And the trick now is to continue with the collaboration for business to continue doing what it's been doing and continue working with government and labor to try and get more out of government, particularly in SOEs and those sorts of areas. And we need to continue to actually send out a message of confidence so that we have the space to actually try and get this economy onto a growth path. I don't think he has done more than he has done. He had to jack up taxes somewhere, and I think that the initiatives he's undertaken on the tax side, I think are, under the circumstances, not horrendous in any way, and I think that I don't think the market will react negatively to it.
Thank you so much for your time today. That was Cas Kovadia, the Managing Director of the Banking Association of South Africa. Very briefly, I know you can't read their minds, nor do you have control over them, but did we manage to keep ratings agencies happy? Matsi?
I would say yes. We've done so well thus far. So perhaps yes. I think the minister's speech did give a sense of we are in control and we are managing ourselves. So, yeah.
Andrew?
I think so. I think it's about confidence. Can we take the tough steps necessary to get the economy back on track? And I think if I was the rating agencies, I would take comfort that he's trying to address this head on.
Fantastic. We'll have to leave it there for today, but thank you so much for your insights and again providing us with perspective on a rather good budget that's come through from the Finance Minister, one that instills confidence in members of the private sector and the international community too. That's where we leave it for now. Thank you to my guests, Matsi Modise, Managing Director at Simodisa, and Andrew Darfur, Group Chief Executive at Alexander Forbes, and Cas Kovadia, who we had on the line earlier on from the Banking Association of South Africa.